Spartanburg, South Carolina. Not merely a town, but the very heartbeat of NASCAR's untamed genesis. Here, speed wasn't forged on assembly lines, but by calloused hands, and legends weren't born in boardrooms, but in the sweat-soaked confines of humble garages. Among these titans of torque, a singular figure emerged, Mark Reynolds, a master mechanic, a silent visionary whose pioneering inventions shielded drivers from the brink, and whose engines roared to life, defining an entire era of American racing. Yet, in the crisp air of January 1983, at the zenith of his unparalleled craft, Reynolds boarded a flight for Florida. And then, as if swallowed by the vast, indifferent sky, he vanished, without a trace. How could a man so intrinsically tethered to precision, to the tangible mechanics of the world, simply dissipate? And why, in the grand narrative of speed, did the world choose to forget him? Few towns, through the long, dusty annals of American racing, ever resonated with the primal symphony of engines quite like Spartanburg once did. Through the roaring 1960s and the grit of the 70s, this pocket of South Carolina wasn't defined by gleaming skyscrapers or the hushed whispers of corporate power. It was a crucible of garages, where welding sparks danced like fireflies in the twilight, and men, with grease etched into their very skin, understood an engine's every tremor, as others might decipher sacred texts. NASCAR in those nascent days was raw, visceral. It was built not by the cold calculations of corporations, but by hands that forever carried the indelible scent of oil and gasoline. And among these fiercely dedicated men, one name was whispered when the conversation turned to unwavering precision: Mark Reynolds. He was no flamboyant showman, no daredevil driver courting the roar of the crowd. He sought no cameras, no thunderous applause. Reynolds was the ghost in the pit lane, a sentinel in the shadows, his sleeves forever rolled, his head bowed in communion with the intricate hum of an engine block. He was of moderate height, his frame compact, almost sculpted, mirroring the machines he so meticulously served, tight, deliberate, forged for endurance. His colleagues often remarked that his eyes, sharp and ceaseless, rarely rested. Even as he listened, one could sense him perpetually measuring the unseen, dissecting problems in the quiet theater of his mind. He spoke with a clipped urgency, sometimes impatient, yet every word carried an undeniable purpose. When he worked, the clamor of the world outside simply ceased to exist. Before the first hesitant rays of light dared to kiss the fields of Spartanburg, Reynolds was already at Bud Moore's garage. Donning his coveralls, a rag perpetually clutched in hand, he moved as though his day had begun hours before the sun. Lunch was a solitary affair, consumed standing beside the very workbench where he meticulously coaxed carburetors apart and tested the taut resilience of valve springs. He drank no alcohol on workdays, not even a solitary beer, a rare discipline among the hard-driving men of that era. For Reynolds, precision wasn't merely a skill, it was a sacred duty, and discipline the only superstition he allowed himself to believe in. Those fortunate enough to cross his path during those formative years recall two defining traits: his profound silence and his unshakable certainty. When Mark Reynolds declared a car ready, it didn't merely finish the race, it conquered it. When he cautioned a driver about a belt's fraying edge, the warning was heeded without question. He didn't just construct faster machines, he engineered survival. In an age where fatal crashes were a grim, all-too-frequent punctuation to the roar of the track, Reynolds became renowned for innovations that subtly, yet fundamentally, reshaped the very fabric of the sport. He devised a crucial third seatbelt, a silent guardian against the primary strap's dangerous slip, and his unwavering insistence on the integration of headrests, initially dismissed as superfluous, would, in time, save countless lives. Darlington Raceway, recognizing his profound impact, honored him with a safety award, etching his name alongside the very drivers whose lives he had, in quiet dignity, preserved. Through the transformative 1960s, Reynolds ascended, evolving from a skilled mechanic to an indispensable crew chief, his expertise sought by names that consistently blazed across the leaderboards: Joe Weatherly, Billy Wade, Donnie Allison. When both Weatherly and Wade met their tragic ends in separate, brutal accidents, Reynolds retreated into months of intense, almost obsessive deliberation. He wrestled with the tormenting question of what unseen flaw, what overlooked detail could have averted such profound loss. From the crucible of that grief, a revolutionary concept emerged: advanced restraint systems, a resolute commitment to bolt responsibility firmly to the untamed beast of raw speed. This was his inherent nature. Where others perceived glamour, he saw the lurking shadow of risk. Where victory glittered in their eyes, he fixated on the stark imperative of survival. By 1967, Reynolds commanded his own team, a modest, unassuming shop nestled on Reedville Road within the nostalgic glow of the Beacon Drive-In. His cars were undeniably fast, his pit crews models of flawless precision. In a mere 4 years, his team claimed 5 triumphant victories and nearly 40 top 10 finishes. Yet, paradoxically, triumph on the asphalt did not translate to prosperity in the ledger. Reynolds' Achilles' heel lay not in the intricate dance of gears and pistons, but in the cold, unforgiving world of the office. He hemorrhaged money faster than he earned it, his trust too readily given, his nature too gentle to relentlessly pursue outstanding debts. By 1971, his dream folded, a casualty of relentless financial strain. On the somber day he shuttered his shop, he lingered long after the last man had departed, listening as the final engine cooled, its metallic sigh echoing in the profound silence. That sound, he later confided to a friend, felt like something far more profound than a mere motor dying. It felt like the inexorable end of an era. In the aftermath, he became a wanderer, a hired gun drifting through NASCAR's sprawling ecosystem. He lent his unparalleled expertise to DieGuard Racing, meticulously crafting engines for Donnie Allison, and later for a rising star named Darrell Waltrip. When Waltrip's engines failed spectacularly in consecutive races, the blame unjustifiably fell squarely upon Reynolds. He was dismissed. He offered no protest. He simply gathered his tools, placing them with practiced care into the same worn leather satchel he had carried since his earliest days, and walked away. The subsequent decade blurred into a haze of restless movement. He filed for bankruptcy with his second wife, migrating from the familiar landscapes of North Carolina to Georgia, and then finally southward to Florida. There, a new world beckoned, the burgeoning high-stakes realm of powerboat racing. The core technology remained familiar: engines, combustion, the relentless pursuit of endurance. But the environment was a stark contrast. The bustling docks of Pompano Beach were a far cry from the grease-stained sanctity of Spartanburg's garages. The air, thick with the tang of salt and gasoline, carried a different rhythm. Men here wore designer sunglasses and glinting gold watches, a world away from the oil-streaked shirts he had known. In this new domain, Reynolds contributed his genius to the design of marine engines for a team known as Class Act Racing. It was a smaller, tighter circle, imbued with an undercurrent of quiet secrecy. Whispers abounded of boat mechanics who moonlighted for less legitimate operations, drug runners leveraging souped-up speedboats to ferry contraband from the Caribbean's illicit currents. Whether Reynolds was ever truly aware of these darker dealings remained unproven. What was known was his unwavering routine: long hours, cash payments for his services, and a resolute silence regarding the identities and activities of his employers. His daughter, Tina, visited him briefly during those years. She recalled the cramped confines of his small apartment, the pervasive scent of engine oil even indoors, and a father who seemed more like a distant colleague than a loving parent. Their conversations were often fraught with tension. He was not a man who offered easy apologies. When she departed Florida, she harbored the fleeting hope that time and distance might mend the fractured threads between them. They did not speak again until Christmas of 1982. That winter, Reynolds journeyed northward to New Jersey, seeking the warmth of his aging mother's home. He stayed for a few days, running errands, sharing meals at the same kitchen table where he had sat as a boy. Neighbors remembered him as quiet, polite, perhaps carrying a weary burden. He spoke of returning to Florida soon, hinting at unfinished work. On December 25th, he made a brief phone call to his daughter in South Carolina. The conversation was terse, polite, almost guarded. He urged her to keep in touch. She did not know it would be the last time she would ever hear his voice. 2 days later, Reynolds packed his faithful leather satchel once more. He bid farewell to his mother's house in Trenton, reassuring her not to worry, promising to call upon his arrival. He was last seen at Newark Airport that morning, boarding a flight bound for Miami. The weather was clear. The flight passed without incident. But from the moment he stepped off that plane, Mark Reynolds ceased to exist in any official record. No credit card transactions, no bank withdrawals, no call to his family, no further confirmed sightings. To the racing world, he was simply a man who had once been everywhere in the paddock and now was nowhere at all. To his family, he was a voice that had fallen silent mid-sentence. The last tangible trace he left behind was a note, penned in his precise, slanted handwriting on his mother's kitchen counter: "I'll call when I get home." He never did. And from that flight in late December 1982, no one ever saw Mark Reynolds again. The first tremor of alarm rippled through the ordinary rhythm of waiting. For 5 days following Mark Reynolds' flight from Newark to Miami, the telephone in his mother's quiet house remained stubbornly silent. She attempted to quell the nascent fear. Her son had always been prone to unpredictable absences, often consumed by his work for days before remembering to call. But by the 6th day, a chilling instinct began to settle, a shadow that refused to yield. She dialed his Florida number. No answer. Again and again, only the hollow sound of ringing that never reached a voice. By the week's end, she contacted his daughter, Tina Reynolds, in South Carolina. The two women, united by a growing dread, exchanged notes, desperately hoping one of them had gleaned a shred of information the other hadn't. Neither had. Reynolds' last confirmed movement was that flight south. From there, the trail vanished into thin air. Then came the phone call that would forever alter the course of their agonizing search. A woman's voice, soft, trembling, almost rehearsed, introduced herself as Betty. She claimed to be Mark Reynolds' girlfriend, calling from Florida. According to her, Reynolds had been piloting a small Cessna plane near the Bahamas when it plunged into the ocean. "He's gone," she whispered, her voice fracturing. "I thought you should know." The line went dead, a cruel silence descending before anyone could utter another question. No date, no coordinates, no passenger list, no recovery efforts. For a few fleeting hours, the family desperately wanted to believe it, not out of a wish for his demise, but because a crash, however tragic, offered an explanation, something verifiable, documentable, comprehensible. But as they began to make their own inquiries, that fragile veneer of certainty crumbled. The Federal Aviation Administration held no record of any civilian plane crash involving a Cessna in or around the Bahamas during that crucial week. The U.S. Coast Guard reported nothing recovered, no distress signals, no missing aircraft matching the description. When investigators later examined the registration number, eventually provided by one of Reynolds' acquaintances, they unearthed something far stranger. The plane was not destroyed at all. It had been resold multiple times in the years following 1983, a phantom vessel in a phantom accident. The story of the crash, the only anchor they had, no longer held. Tina and her grandmother began a relentless pursuit of every conceivable lead. They telephoned local police departments in Fort Lauderdale, Miami, and Pompano Beach. None had received a missing person report for Mark Reynolds. They contacted the Bahamian authorities. No record of any foreign pilot missing from that period. They dispatched letters to airports, insurance companies, even the racing teams he had once devoted his unparalleled skills to. Nothing. The name Betty led to nowhere. By late January, the family, with a heavy heart, decided to file an official report. The local sheriff's office in South Carolina took the statement, but explained, almost apologetically, that jurisdictional limits rendered the case profoundly difficult. If he disappeared in Florida, it's a Florida matter. If it happened over water, that's federal. The file was dutifully sent to Miami, where it was quietly entered into the system and almost immediately stalled. There was precious little for investigators to work with. Reynolds possessed no recent photographs, no active bank cards, and no known residence under his own name. His passport had not been utilized to leave the country. His Social Security number yielded no new employment or tax activity. It was as if he had simply stepped off that plane and dissolved into the very air. In the weeks that followed, his mother, consumed by a mother's boundless worry, refused to rest. She kept a notepad by the kitchen phone, tirelessly scribbling down every name, every number, every fleeting rumor. She called the FAA, the NTSB, even a contact she unearthed at Prudential Insurance, her voice taut with desperation, inquiring if any claims had been made in his name. There were none. She dispatched a handwritten letter to the U.S. Embassy in Nassau, a heartfelt plea for assistance in confirming a plane crash that no one seemed to remember. Weeks later, the embassy replied politely, "No records found." The deeper they delved, the more contradictions surfaced. Reynolds' landlady in Florida claimed he had already vacated his apartment before Christmas, asserting he intended to travel for business. Yet several neighbors swore they saw him loading his car after the holidays as if preparing for a significant move. These discrepancies, though seemingly minor, coalesced into a portrait that simply refused to make sense. Tina, meanwhile, reached out to former colleagues in the racing world. Some hadn't heard from her father in years. Others harbored vague recollections of seeing him in early 1983, though none could agree on the specific location. One man in Pompano Beach recounted Reynolds speaking of getting out, of starting over somewhere else. Another insisted he was fine, just keeping his head down. This cascade of confusion spawned a fertile ground for rumors. The family heard unsettling stories of Reynolds' alleged involvement with a shadowy group of men smuggling drugs through high-speed boats, a claim impossible to verify, yet disturbingly common in that part of Florida at the time. There were whispers that he had been cooperating with federal authorities, perhaps as an informant, and that his disappearance was an integral part of a witness protection scheme. But there were no court records, no witness lists, no federal files hinting at such a deal. By February, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement briefly reviewed the case and just as swiftly closed it. citing insufficient evidence to indicate foul play. The official classification: missing person. Voluntary disappearance suspected. For the family, it was a wound that refused to heal, precisely because it had no definitive shape. They knew not whether to grieve or to simply, eternally wait. Reynolds' mother prayed every morning at the same kitchen table where he'd eaten his last meal with her. His daughter kept the worn brown box of papers close, dialing every number she could unearth, only to encounter disconnected lines and disheartening dead ends. Then came the message that froze them in place. One evening, Reynolds' sister received a chilling phone call from an unlisted number. The voice on the other end was low, deliberate, and unmistakably male. It uttered a single ominous sentence before abruptly hanging up. "Don't talk to the authorities. It will be dangerous for your family." There was no conceivable way to trace the call. The warning left them profoundly shaken, adrift between the terrifying possibility that they were protecting him, or, more disturbingly, protecting themselves. For the first time, they ceased their relentless calling, their incessant writing. The notepad by the phone remained blank. The fragile hope that the truth might still be found began to recede, shrinking into an oppressive silence. The brown box of papers remained on the table, but no one dared to open it anymore. By spring, the local police formally marked the case as inactive. In the margin of the file, an officer had scrawled a single stark phrase: "No further leads." The story of Mark Reynolds slipped quietly into the periphery of Spartanburg's vibrant racing history. The man who had once engineered engines that defined a generation had simply vanished into an empty sky, leaving behind only the unsettling residue of rumors and a pervasive fear. And from that moment on, no one in his family dared to speak his name too loudly. From 1984 onward, the story of Mark Reynolds receded further, slipping quietly into the static of passing time. In the cold, impartial realm of official files, his name existed merely as a line in a report, ominously marked inactive. The Florida investigators who had once engaged in a flurry of phone calls with their counterparts in New Jersey ceased updating the case entirely. The folder was boxed, shelved, and, in due course, transferred to a vast records warehouse, destined to remain untouched for decades. No new sightings, no correspondence, no discernible financial movement. To the myriad agencies involved, Reynolds became one of hundreds of adults who had, quite simply, walked away from their lives. In Spartanburg, however, silence never equated to acceptance. Reynolds' mother, a woman of unyielding spirit, continued to call the same disconnected numbers, long after she knew there would be no answer. She spoke to neighbors, to former co-workers, even to a retired pilot who vaguely claimed to recall seeing Mark in Miami. Each conversation concluded in the same desolate manner, with uncertainty. Over time, her health, fragile with age and worry, began to decline. Her memory grew clouded, yet the single question she posed to every visitor remained an unwavering beacon of her enduring hope. "Have you heard from Mario?" She passed away in 1986, never knowing what fate had befallen her son. At her funeral, the family, in a poignant gesture of eternal hope, left an empty space beside her in the burial plot, just in case. After her death, the profound burden of remembrance fell to Tina Reynolds, Mark's daughter. She inherited the small, unassuming brown box that had resided on her grandmother's kitchen table for so long. Inside lay the fragile fragments of a life that had once felt so solid. Faded photographs, brittle insurance stubs, tax papers, a sun-bleached postcard from Daytona, and a handful of handwritten notes penned in her father's precise, slanted script. Initially, she kept it under her bed, unable to bear the emotional weight of sifting through its contents for extended periods. But as the months sped into years, the box transformed into her silent compass, a poignant reminder that there had once been a man who cherished machines,
who could decipher an engine's very soul by sound alone, and who, for reasons still shrouded in impenetrable mystery, had simply departed the world without a trace. In the years that followed his disappearance, rumors, wild and unverified, began to usurp the sparse facts. Within the close-knit racing community, speculation proliferated like tenacious weeds. Some whispered that Reynolds had been ruthlessly murdered for crossing the wrong people in Florida's cutthroat drug circuits, that his unparalleled knowledge of high-performance boats had rendered him both invaluable and tragically vulnerable. Others clung to the belief that he had cooperated with federal authorities, trading vital information for the promise of safety and a new identity. Those who preferred a simpler, more earthly explanation claimed he had merely walked away, that the crushing weight of debts, the sting of disappointments, and the bitter taste of professional failures had propelled him to erase his past and embark anew far beyond its reach. Each theory, however fantastical, was delivered with a tone of unwavering conviction, yet none, stubbornly, yielded any tangible evidence.
Reynolds' name surfaced occasionally in the local gossip columns, usually woven into the fabric of myth rather than anchored in verifiable memory. Every few years, someone would claim a sighting, once in Tampa, once in Texas, once in a secluded marina near Nassau. Each fleeting glimpse, however, dissolved under the cold light of scrutiny. Meanwhile, NASCAR, a relentless juggernaut, forged ahead. The sport itself was undergoing a profound metamorphosis. Sponsors grew exponentially larger. Tracks became incrementally safer. Cars screamed faster than ever before. A new generation of young drivers ascended through the ranks, and the pervasive magic of television brought the thunderous roar of racing into millions of homes. New engineers, their names celebrated, became household figures. The old garages of Spartanburg, once the very mechanical soul of the sport, began their slow, inevitable decline. One by one, they succumbed, transforming into anonymous warehouses, sterile storage units, or simply empty, desolate lots. At Darlington Raceway, Reynolds' modest plaque remained a quiet sentinel in the Joe Weatherly Museum, tucked away on a side shelf amidst vibrant displays honoring drivers who had met their tragic ends in the relentless pursuit of speed. Tourists rarely paused to read its understated inscription. His groundbreaking innovations, the revolutionary three-point seatbelt, the life-saving padded headrest, had long since been assimilated into industry standards, their origins largely forgotten. Few remembered the man whose inventive mind had first conceived of them. Tina often found herself drawn to that exhibit. She would stand before the unassuming plaque in profound silence, attempting to conjure an image of her father as others had once described him, singularly focused, brilliantly intuitive, sometimes maddeningly impossible. She often wondered if he had known in those final enigmatic days that his work would ultimately outlive his name. By 1989, Tina, a woman of unyielding resolve, began making her own rigorous inquiries. She drafted letters to federal agencies under the formidable shield of the Freedom of Information Act, requesting records on missing pilots and any potential admissions into witness protection programs. Most responses arrived in the same disheartening form: no records responsive to your request. The rest were so heavily redacted as to be utterly meaningless. She engaged a private investigator in Florida, but his meticulous findings merely mirrored what the police had already uncovered: no property, no active bank accounts, no death certificate. He gently informed her that after so much time, people rarely wished to be found. But Tina, a repository of unwavering hope, refused to allow the case to simply fade into oblivion.
She painstakingly organized her father's scattered papers into meticulously labeled folders by date, annotating the scant details she could still confirm. She interviewed one of his old crew members, a grizzled veteran who told her, with a knowing glint in his eye, that Mark didn't know how to quit. If he disappeared, it wasn't an accident. The sobering truth, however, was that no one truly knew what Mark Reynolds had become in those final enigmatic months. His life had been a restless collection of engines, races, and ceaseless motion. It wasn't difficult to envision him pursuing yet another opportunity somewhere south of the Florida coast, or, as others grimly believed, becoming ensnared in something far darker, something that left him no viable escape. As the 1990s dawned, the world surrounding his profound absence transformed beyond recognition. Computers replaced the meticulous hand-drawn schematics. Digital telemetry, once a futuristic dream, became an indispensable fixture in the very garages he had once ruled with sheer intuition alone. The men who had worked tirelessly beside him were either long retired or, tragically, gone. In this new era of corporate-driven racing, the name Mark Reynolds became a mere footnote, a spectral whisper of a time when racing was forged by the primal elements of grease, sweat, and an unspoken trust. For Tina, that creeping loss of memory felt like a second, even crueler disappearance. The first had stolen her father, the second threatened to erase him from the very history he had so profoundly helped to build. She kept the brown box sealed, but always within reach, unable to discard the paltry remnants of him. Occasionally, on quiet, introspective nights, she would lift the lid and carefully unfold one of the faded photographs. A young man in oil-stained coveralls, his head bent in focused communion with a car engine, eyes narrowed, and an almost fierce concentration. She would trace the familiar outline of his face with her thumb, a silent, lingering question hanging in the air. What did he see in those final, uncommunicated days that compelled him to step irrevocably beyond reach? By the end of the decade, the official case remained stubbornly frozen. Florida's missing person files listed him simply as unresolved, presumed voluntary disappearance. There were no updates, no fresh evidence to contradict that somber assumption. But among those who had truly known him, the silence carried a profound, undeniable weight. They spoke of him not with pity or fear, but with a reluctant, almost reverent respect. A man who might have chosen to vanish rather than compromise the very essence of who he was. Still, for his daughter, absence was not a choice. It was a permanent, aching question mark.
On the sun-drenched racetracks of the South, new engines thundered across the asphalt, their raw power tempered by the very safety principles he had meticulously designed decades before. The sport he had helped to make safer now roared on, heedless of his absence. And as the relentless years accrued, one truth settled quietly beneath all the noise. On the track, they still spoke of speed and glory. But no one mentioned the engineer who had, in silent dedication, built the very belts that saved their lives. In 1997, a full 14 years after Mark Reynolds had vanished, his name reappeared quietly, almost by sheer accident, in the labyrinthine records of an insurance company. It began not with a sensational tip or a dramatic confession, but with the unassuming presence of paperwork. A claims adjuster at Prudential Insurance, diligently reviewing a backlog of dormant policies, noticed one filed under the name Mark Reynolds, Florida, dating back to the early 1980s. The policy listed his mother as the beneficiary and carried a modest life insurance value, untouched and unclaimed for more than a decade. The file had languished unresolved because, quite simply, there had never been a death certificate. Initially, it seemed like a routine administrative cleanup, another form awaiting its inevitable closure. But when the adjuster, with a keen eye for detail, cross-referenced Reynolds' policy against federal records, she uncovered something that jarringly refused to fit. The aircraft registered as the one Reynolds had supposedly died in, a small Cessna 210, was still very much active, listed under a different owner and serial number. It had in fact changed hands 3 times since 1983. There was no record of a crash, no insurance claim, no official investigation. The paper trail, stark and unyielding, directly contradicted the convenient story his family had been fed. This astonishing discovery did not in itself trigger any official reopening of the inquiry, but it profoundly stirred something that had lain dormant within his daughter. Tina Reynolds, now in her late 30s, had, in a sense, built her entire life around unanswered questions. She had married, moved, and started a family of her own. Yet the small brown box containing her father's documents faithfully followed her from home to home. When she learned of the prudential finding, she recognized it as more than mere coincidence. It was, for her, irrefutable proof that something in the carefully constructed narrative had been fundamentally wrong from the very beginning.
She hired a private investigator named Harold Nix, a retired detective from Broward County, seasoned by years of grappling with cold cases and perplexing missing person inquiries. Nix worked quietly, without the overt authority of a badge, but with a relentless persistence honed by years of unfinished business. His initial step was to meticulously reconstruct Reynolds' last confirmed movements: New Jersey, Miami, then the profound silence. The airport manifests confirmed the outbound flight, but there was no connecting ticket, no rental car reservation, no hotel registration in Reynolds' name. His name simply evaporated from the official records after the arrival scan. Nix contacted the Federal Aviation Administration, who provided the aircraft's updated registration history. The Cessna 210 was indeed still in service, now based in North Carolina, owned by a small charter company. "That plane didn't crash," Nix informed Tina, his voice flat with certainty, "which means the crash story was invented. The question is, why?" The answer did not emerge easily. In the months that followed, Nix journeyed to Florida, endeavoring to trace Reynolds' last known contacts within the shadowy Pompano Beach boating scene. It was a world half legitimate, half submerged in clandestine dealings, where high-speed boats served both the thrill of racing and the illicit pursuits of smuggling. Many of the individuals who might have known Reynolds were either deceased, long retired, or stubbornly unwilling to speak. But a single fragile lead eventually surfaced: an aging mechanic who had once worked for Class Act Racing, the very outfit Reynolds had joined after his departure from NASCAR. The man remembered him vividly. "Mario was restless," he recounted, his voice raspy with age. "Talked about how he'd had enough of the noise, the racing, the bills, people always wanting something from him. Said one day he'd go far away where nobody could find him. He said it like a joke, but he meant it." Nix pressed for more details. The mechanic believed Reynolds had been spending time with a few men involved in transport jobs, the kind that never appeared on any official contract. He didn't know their names, only that they utilized speedboats fitted with highly modified engines capable of easily outrunning the Coast Guard. If he worked on those, he added with a knowing glance, he knew what he was getting into.
For Tina, this information was both a tantalizing lead and a crushing weight. It confirmed a suspicion she had quietly harbored for years, that her father's final chapter might not have been a clean one. Yet there was something in those words, to go far away where nobody could find him, that unsettled her more profoundly than the rumors of crime. It sounded less like an escape from imminent danger and more like a deliberate, calculated decision. Nix's next step was to probe the very limits of that chilling possibility. If Reynolds had orchestrated his own disappearance, he would require money, a new identity, and the anonymity of distance. There were no withdrawals from his known accounts, but that detail held little significance in an era when cash was king. As for identity, Nix scrupulously checked the Social Security Administration for any activity under Reynolds' number. None. Then, through a discreet contact in the Bahamas, he unearthed something utterly unexpected. A bartender in Nassau, who had worked in the bustling harbor district in the early 1980s, recounted a peculiar story. A few months after Reynolds's disappearance, a man began frequenting a small bar popular with American expats. He was in his 50s, spoke with a distinct Southern drawl, and introduced himself simply as Mark Russo. The man always paid in cash, tipped generously, and never once divulged where he lived. When shown an old photograph of Reynolds, the bartender hesitated, then nodded slowly, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. That's close. The eyes, the way he held his drink. I think that's him. The detail, tantalizing though it was, proved impossible to definitively verify, but it was enough to irrevocably shift the tone of the entire investigation. If the man truly was Reynolds, it meant that the fabricated plane crash and the girlfriend's deceptive phone call were deliberate misdirection, a carefully constructed smokescreen. He hadn't died. He had, with chilling precision, erased himself. The only remaining question was whether he had done so out of profound fear or by a conscious, unwavering choice.
Nix presented his findings to Tina in a stark, unadorned report. Dates, names, witness statements, nothing more. She read it 3 times, each pass deepening the chill in her bones, then carefully folded it and returned it to the brown box. "If he's alive," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper, "he didn't want to be found. Maybe that's its own kind of death." The investigator offered no argument. In his meticulously kept notes, Nix recorded that the evidence supported both outcomes. The absence of a body meant Reynolds could have survived. The absence of a definitive motive meant he might have simply fled. He underlined one sentence, his pen pressing hard. All data points to intent. That chilling conclusion echoed a truth Tina had never consciously allowed herself to admit. Her father's disappearance wasn't a tragic accident. It was an act. By the end of the 1990s, the insurance company formally closed its claim, marking it as unverified death. The state of Florida, citing the persistent lack of concrete evidence, steadfastly refused to issue a death certificate. The official record remained frozen in an unsettling equilibrium, a precarious balance between 2 possibilities. Friends and relatives, when queried, still offered competing theories, their voices edged with unwavering conviction. "He was killed," one would assert. "He started over," another would counter. Both statements sounded certain, yet neither could be definitively proven. The deeper investigators delved, the more the facts stubbornly contradicted each other. The plane, the supposed instrument of his demise, existed. The enigmatic girlfriend did not. The man in the Bahamas might have been him, or he might not. Even the carefully constructed timeline of his final days resisted any true clarity. Yet one unassailable truth endured across every version of the story. Mark Reynolds had disappeared with profound purpose. Whether to escape danger, to shed the weight of guilt, or simply to flee from himself, he had penned the final elusive chapter of his life in invisible ink. 30 years after he had left his mother's kitchen and boarded that fateful flight to Florida, every document, every whispered rumor, every carefully constructed theory pointed to the same undeniable conclusion. Mark Reynolds didn't vanish by accident. He vanished because he wanted to. By the turn of the century, Mark Reynolds' case had calcified into little more than a perplexing riddle, meticulously preserved within the labyrinthine folds of paperwork. Investigators, tenacious journalists, and former colleagues each meticulously constructed their own theories, none conclusive, all disturbingly plausible. What remained was a tangled web of stark contradictions and an impenetrable silence. The first theory clung to the notion that Reynolds had met his end precisely as the initial whispered story claimed, a catastrophic plane crash off the sun-drenched coast of the Bahamas. It was a narrative simple in its finality, yet utterly impossible to substantiate. No debris, no manifest of passengers, no official report. The
The Cessna's serial number, which stubbornly remained active in federal logs, effectively vaporized whatever fragile credibility that version once possessed. It was a ghost crash, convenient, cleanly fabricated, and utterly false. The second theory, far darker in its implications, suggested that Reynolds had been murdered. By the early 1980s, Florida's burgeoning powerboat world was awash with illicit money, a direct pipeline from the lucrative drug smuggling operations. Reynolds' one-time associate, former NASCAR driver Gary Ballow, had been arrested in 1983 for orchestrating the maritime transport of Colombian marijuana. Their professional overlap was undeniable. Reynolds himself had constructed the very engines capable of such breathtaking speed. To some investigators, the timing of these events was far too precise to dismiss as mere coincidence. Perhaps Reynolds knew too much, or perhaps, more simply, he had become a dangerous liability. Yet no witness, no surviving record ever connected his name directly to any federal case. There was a compelling motive, but a frustrating absence of tangible evidence, a crime without a body. The third theory posited that Reynolds had entered a witness protection program, that he had cooperated with federal authorities and been granted a meticulously constructed new life under the impenetrable veil of federal secrecy. This compelling narrative offered an elegant explanation for the total erasure of his identity, yet it failed to account for the stubborn lack of official documentation. Freedom of Information requests filed in the late 1990s yielded no trace of any such deal, no sealed case bearing his initials. For law enforcement, he simply did not exist within their classified books. The fourth, and ultimately most enduring theory, was that Reynolds had orchestrated his own disappearance, a deliberate act of will. The available data compellingly supported this interpretation. Mounting debts, 2 failed marriages, professional ties irrevocably severed, and a daughter alienated. His last confirmed words to an acquaintance, "I'm going somewhere no one can find me," read less like a desperate threat and more like a carefully articulated intention. Psychologists, later consulted by researchers, noted that voluntary disappearances often share 2 crucial markers. The subject leaves behind minimal assets and resolutely rejects all ties to their previous name and identity. Reynolds matched both patterns with chilling precision. Then came a final, uncertain spark in the pervasive darkness. In 2001, a marine engineer in Texas reported a curious encounter. He described meeting an older man who called himself Mr. Brooks, spoke with a fluent Southern cadence, and claimed to have built engines for NASCAR before it got soft. The man was quiet, undeniably competent, and fiercely protective of his past. When shown old photographs of Reynolds years later, the witness hesitated, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Could be him," he conceded, his voice thoughtful. "Could also be someone who wanted to be him." The sighting, like so many others, was never definitively confirmed. By then, nearly 2 decades had elapsed since Reynolds' last verifiable trace. Theories continued to orbit the same profound void: death, murder, escape. But none possessed the definitive power to close it. The truth, elusive and stubbornly opaque, resided somewhere between 2 stark realities: a life brutally ended without a body, or a man still drawing breath, concealed beneath an assumed name. By 2005, the name Mark Reynolds had largely receded into a mere formality within the vast archives of Florida law enforcement. It was one more entry among thousands of unresolved disappearances, cases stretching back across decades, gathering dust and fading into obscurity.
Yet, even after 22 agonizing years, his particular case stubbornly refused to vanish completely. The old paper file had yellowed with age, its pages brittle and fragile, yet the story embedded within them still carried the faint, persistent pulse of unfinished business.
That spring, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement undertook a comprehensive review of a backlog of inactive cases, part of an internal audit designed to clear lingering administrative clutter. Reynolds's folders surfaced once more, emerging more by sheer accident than by deliberate intention. The report itself was brief, a scant handful of pages summarizing the original missing person notice, the futile investigation into the supposed plane crash, and a brief note appended in 1997 referencing the mysterious insurance inquiry. The officer tasked with reviewing the file scribbled a single terse line in the margin. Recommend status update? Presumed deceased. It was neither a blinding revelation nor a comforting resolution, merely the cold, dispassionate march of bureaucratic procedure. Under Florida statute, an individual who has been missing for more than 5 years without any verifiable evidence of life may be formally declared missing, presumed deceased. In strictly legal terms, this allowed property to be settled, insurance policies to be closed, and family members to pursue the necessary final paperwork. In human terms, however, it was a stark admission of profound exhaustion. The announcement, discreetly issued in a quiet departmental memo, carried no fanfare, no public ceremony. There was no hearing, no trial, no public acknowledgement of the decision. The memo did not venture to name a cause of death or suggest foul play. It simply, dispassionately recognized the persistent absence of proof to the contrary. The case was reclassified, but pointedly it was not closed. The final sentence read, with a lingering hint of possibility, subject to reopening upon presentation of verifiable evidence. For Reynolds's daughter, Tina Reynolds, the reclassification meant little. She had long since ceased to expect a miraculous discovery that would, with a sudden flash of clarity, explain the years of silence. Still, she dutifully attended the small formal administrative meeting where officials confirmed the decision, her voice steady but distant as she asked whether the file could remain accessible should any new evidence, however improbable, ever appear. "If something turns up," she insisted, her gaze unwavering, "DNA, a photograph, anything, I want to know." The supervising officer nodded, his expression somber. "If we ever find proof of life, this file will come back." That phrase, proof of life, stayed with her long after the meeting concluded. It sounded clinical, almost detached, yet profoundly personal, as though her father's very existence had been reduced to a mere question of record-keeping. In later years, younger investigators occasionally revisited the Reynolds file, more out of genuine curiosity than out of any official duty. One of them, a detective named Evan Clark, developed a particular, almost obsessive interest. Born long after Reynolds had vanished, he harbored a deep fascination with old mechanical legends and the blurred, often contradictory lines between truth and rumor. In an interview for a local paper, Clark described the case as a study in vanishing. He told the reporter, "If he were alive today, he'd be in his 90s. But the record stays open because no one ever confirmed a death. In this line of work, a missing person without a body isn't gone. They're just off the map." Over time, the case evolved into something of a quiet, cautionary lesson for rookie officers, a stark demonstration of how easily a life can slip between jurisdictions, how a single, carefully placed lie, like a deceptive phone call about a plane crash, can irrevocably shape an entire investigation. Reynolds' disappearance was cited in training modules about interagency coordination, a textbook example of the insidious consequences when small inconsistencies are overlooked or ignored. For Tina, the years continued to flow forward in quiet, relentless circles. She kept her father's brown box sealed, but perpetually within reach. Unable, even now, to discard the precious few remnants of him. When DNA technology began to revolutionize cold case work in the late 2000s, she eagerly offered a sample to both state and federal databases, a quiet act of enduring hope. Each year, she received the same automated, impersonal reply: no match found. The practical world, however, moved inexorably onward. The insurance policy was finally settled. The family property in New Jersey, a tangible link to a past life, was transferred to new ownership. The government, with a final bureaucratic flourish, declared the matter concluded in the eyes of the law. Yet, in the small, dwindling circle of people who still remembered, Mark Reynolds was neither definitively alive nor truly dead. He simply existed in a nebulous space between, defined only by his profound absence.
Then, more than 3 decades after the day he vanished, a small, unexpected discovery rippled through that resolute silence. In 2019, an archivist meticulously cataloging photographs for a defunct marine racing company in Pompano Beach stumbled upon a faded, nondescript envelope marked Class Act, mid-1980s. Inside were several black and white prints, images of boat crews, intricate engine assemblies, and dockside races. In one image, slightly out of focus, stood a man near the very edge of the frame, silver-haired, wearing a cap, his arms crossed casually beside a sleek boat emblazoned with the Class Act Racing logo. The archivist noticed nothing particularly unusual until he discerned the name meticulously scrawled in pencil on the back: M. Reynolds. The photo itself was undated. No one could definitively identify who had written the note or precisely when, but when a copy eventually reached a retired mechanic who had once worked alongside Mark, he studied it for a long, quiet moment before slowly, deliberately, nodding. "That's him," he said quietly, a tremor in his voice. "Older, but that's him." The image was too grainy, too indistinct for definitive digital verification. Yet its mere existence reopened an old, persistent whisper. If it truly depicted Reynolds, then he had lived beyond 1983, years longer than anyone had ever dared to believe. It suggested a man who had not drowned in the vast, indifferent ocean or been swallowed by the protective embrace of witness protection, but one who had stayed remarkably close to the world he knew best: engines, docks, and the rhythmic roar of power. Investigators treated the find with an appropriate degree of caution. There was simply no way to authentically date the photograph or conclusively identify its subject without DNA evidence or substantial additional context. The official file remained stubbornly unchanged: missing, presumed deceased. But within the department's quiet corridors, the story, like a smoldering ember, gained quiet life once more. Detective Clark summarized it succinctly in his internal memo: possible post-disappearance photograph located, credibility undetermined. For Tina, now approaching 60, the photograph arrived by email from a persistent journalist who, after much effort, had tracked her down. She opened it late one night, the cold light of the screen reflecting in her glasses, illuminating the silent image. The man in the picture was undeniably older, heavier, his jawline softer, blurred by the passage of time. But the eyes, the characteristic posture, the slight, almost intuitive tilt of the head toward the machinery, those were achingly familiar. She stared at it for a long, contemplative time before whispering, "If it's him, I hope he found peace." She did not forward it to the authorities. Instead, she printed a copy, folded it with care, and placed it reverently inside the brown box, nestled among the other precious fragments of his life.
In 2020, the official database still listed the same unchanging conclusion. Status: missing. Presumed deceased. Evidence of death: none. It was an ending only bureaucracy could possibly write. Precise, hollow, and hauntingly indefinite. Yet even now, among those who still remembered the story, the uncertainty stubbornly lingered. Perhaps Mark Reynolds had indeed died in 1983, as the initial paperwork grimly claimed. Perhaps he had lived under another name, diligently fixing engines somewhere near the water, until age finally and inevitably caught up with him. Or perhaps, true to his enigmatic nature, he simply kept moving. Another man in another shop, the familiar, comforting sound of a motor his only constant companion. Whatever the elusive truth, one sentence remains valid, resonating with an undeniable power after all these years. More than 4 decades have now passed since Mark Reynolds vanished, and time has accomplished what even profound mystery could not. It has softened the insistent noise, leaving behind only the haunting echoes of a life lived and then so completely unlived. The case file now resides in sterile digital storage, its pages meticulously scanned and labeled, a cold, clinical reflection of something once raw, profoundly human, and fiercely individual. But beyond the cold confines of the archives, his name still lingers, a subtle presence in places where the pungent scent of oil and fuel still defines memory, where the past is preserved in the very air. At the Darlington Raceway Museum, visitors still encounter a modest bronze bust tucked away on a side shelf near the safety exhibit. The plaque beneath it reads simply, "Mark Reynolds, Engineer and Innovator." Few pause to read further, largely unaware that the man honored there never received his own definitive conclusion. Yet, in the quiet solemnity of that hall, his profound contribution remains powerfully visible, a silent reminder that before the advent of advanced technology and sophisticated telemetry, there were men like Reynolds who steadfastly believed that safety could be meticulously built with skilled hands, unwavering patience, and an almost sacred care. For Tina Reynolds, now in her 60s, her father's legacy is not cast in bronze, but preserved within the fragile confines of cardboard. She still keeps the small, brown box, creased, faded, and fragile with the weight of time, on the highest shelf of her home office. Inside reside the very same documents that once guided her desperate search: his insurance forms, the faded photographs, and a folded racing flag, its edges frayed, that had once belonged to him. She doesn't open the box often, but she knows every single item by heart. When asked once in an interview why she still clung to it, she answered with quiet conviction, "It's all that's left that connects him to us. As long as it's here, he's not entirely gone."
On weekends, when she visits racing events near Charlotte or Daytona, Tina sometimes hears his name whispered by the older mechanics, their voices tinged with a nostalgic reverence. They still recall the profound innovations that, almost imperceptibly, changed their sport. The reinforced belts, the crucial headrest, the quiet, unwavering insistence on safety when others, in their pursuit of glory, foolishly perceived it as weakness. To the new generation of drivers, Reynolds is spoken of almost like a myth, the engineer who vanished between races. His disappearance has become an indelible part of the track's enduring folklore, a cautionary tale every young driver hears at least once, that a man who meticulously built the very tools to save others could not, in the end, save himself from the profound, inescapable weight of his own life. Among law enforcement circles, the case continues to serve a different, more somber purpose. It is frequently cited in lectures about the intricate psychology of disappearance, the inherent limits of investigation. When a person truly desires to erase themselves, it stands as stark, undeniable proof that no amount of evidence can fully reconstruct human willpower, and that the profound human desire for escape can, sometimes, leave fewer traces than even a violent crime. The world Reynolds left behind has transformed beyond recognition. NASCAR has evolved into a colossal sport of corporate speed and digital precision, a universe far removed from the tangible grease and grit of Spartanburg's golden years. Yet the very same safety systems he once designed still faithfully protect every driver who straps themselves into a car. Each restraint, each harness, each padded seat carries a silent whisper of his enduring philosophy, that speed without meticulous care is not courage, but ultimately profound folly. For Tina, the legacy is more intimately private. Each year, on her father's birthday, she carefully takes out the racing flag from the brown box, a square of black and white fabric, its corners gently frayed by the touch of time. She lays it flat on her desk, meticulously smooths out the wrinkles, and sits with it for a few quiet, reflective minutes. "I still keep it folded," she once confided to a reporter. "If he ever comes back, I'll open it for him." She no longer actively searches, but she has never ceased waiting. Not for a definitive answer, those, she has learned, rarely come, but for a profound, abiding sense of peace. Sometimes, she says, she dreams of a man with silver hair, standing by the water, gazing out at the horizon, as if listening to an engine no one else can hear.
In the cold, impartial records, Mark Reynolds remains missing, presumed deceased. In memory, however, he is something else entirely. A mechanic who resolutely refused to accept limits, who left behind both ingenious invention and an enduring, haunting uncertainty. His story endures not because of how it ended, but precisely because of how completely it refused to. 36 years, 50, or however many more may pass, no one can definitively say where Mark Reynolds truly went, or whether he ever once looked back. But on every track he once touched, the safety belts still hold fast, the engines still powerfully turn, and the machines still run on the quiet, enduring faith of the man who, in his singular way, built them. Subscribe to our channel, share this video, and help us keep forgotten stories alive. Every like, every comment, every share keeps the light on for another mystery still waiting to be solved. And tell us, where are you watching from? Because somewhere out there, another story is still idling, waiting for someone to unearth.